Really?
Morley Safer will sit and put flowers and pictures in his background, and it'll drive you crazy.
But it works.
Oh no, he's very good. He's very good
See,
at
I don't know
building
anything about that.
You know, he's an artist type guy. You know.
Mr. Vice President,
Moran.
thank you for doing this. I guess we have Mr. Schmidt to thank for the timing of this.
Set this up. I'd ask you to slip this into your pocket here on the side.
I've already expressed my gratitude for scheduling this interview with you at the end of this day. That was just a great idea.
8 o'clock in the morning or what? On a Sunday?
Yeah.
Well, that sun isn't bright. Which way am I going to be facing?
You're going to be looking right at Terry.
Okay.
How's that? Is that all right for you?
Yeah.
We can change it if you don't like it.
Well, I think this'll work.
Now, if you'd like, you can put the water to the side, and if you
Yeah, I
get
don't need
dry, just we'll stop. If you get dry, just ask for it.
All right.
This is all.
Okay, and are you going to go straight through or take a break? Or?
Yeah, well, we'll go straight through. I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to do this. We'll be back in a moment with the. We'll just do it,
Okay.
And then it'll air pretty much its entirety on Nightline. But before that, tonight we can get it on the Stephanopoulos show. I don't think the feed will allow that, but tonight, tomorrow morning, tomorrow night, and then full.
Just put your jacket down a little bit, sir. It's kind of fun to knock on you.
It's a good day.
Yeah, it has been a good day. Okay.
Love those chopper rides.
Yeah, no, it's a great bunch. Great to come spend some time with the troops.
Yeah.
It's never a bad day doing that.
30 seconds.
Right. And, you know, I actually think it's good for, I mean, somebody who covered the White House for 5 years and was in the bubble, to actually get out and see what we're covering a little bit. Even just a little. You can't be here for 5 hours.
And it's a hothouse atmosphere in the White House.
Right, and it's
briefing
unreal.
room.
It's unreal. I bet you people, well, I know that Elizabeth Vargas, who was here for the elections, will have a very different perspective, I think.
Yeah.
So, we're good?
Rolling speed.
All right. So this is your first trip to Iraq since the fall of Saddam Hussein.
It is.
What surprised you today? What do you know about Iraq today that you didn't know yesterday?
Well, I think, like most people who've looked at it, I've been tremendously impressed with what happened in the election just this past week. I mean, I really think that's maybe a seminal event in the history of Iraq, that it's such an important part of the process of building a democracy, a viable Iraq, an Iraq that can stand on its own, that the thing that strikes you when you come out is just the mood and the demeanor of the people you talk with. You get with Talabani and Joffrey, for example. I've met with both of them before, but they both, I think, were visibly relieved at how big the turnout was, that in fact the process is working. There is strong support, even in the Sunni areas, for participation in the political process.
But you know, we've had elections before in this country now, twice before this year. There was that moment of hope after the January elections with the amazing sights that brought out, and those hopes have been dashed again and again. What makes you think this time it's going to be different?
I disagree with the notion that the hopes have been dashed. I don't think that's true.
Well, the violence has continued.
Well, the violence has continued, but I think the key in terms of looking at the elections is that they've made every single milestone that's been set, every single one. From the time we turned over sovereignty in June of '04 to the first elections in January, then writing a constitution, getting the constitution ratified, and now national elections under that new constitution. They've had 3 elections this year. Each one's gotten better and stronger and more effective. I do think it's serving to undermine the legitimacy of the insurgency. I think it will make it increasingly difficult for the insurgents to be effective. We see it, for example, in the volume of tips that we get from the Iraqi people, intelligence information about where to find weapons caches or who's responsible for some of the terrorist attacks. There's been a quantum leap over the course of the last year in terms of the number of intelligence reports coming in. The economy's doing better. The services, the Iraqi security services, are clearly much, much better now. There's a big change there over the last 18 months. I met today with some of the members and the leader of the 9th Mechanized Iraqi Division. These are men who signed on to support the new government, And the benefit of having that election now is we're going to have a government, a legitimate government of Iraq that nobody can claim lacks legitimacy. It's an Iraqi government elected by Iraqis under a constitution written by Iraqis. And so I think all of that is measurable progress. And while the level of violence has continued, I do believe that when we look back on this period of time, 2005 will have been the turning point when, in fact, we made sufficient progress both on the political front and the security front, so that we'll see that as the watershed year.
You talk about undermining the legitimacy of the resistance. Before the war, you said Americans would be greeted as liberators here, and yet your own trip here today was undertaken in such secrecy that not even the Prime Minister of this country knew you were coming, and your movements around are in incredible secrecy and security. Do you ever think about how and why you got it wrong?
I don't think I got it wrong. I think the vast majority of the Iraqi people are grateful for what the United States did. I think they believe overwhelmingly that they're better off today than they were when Saddam Hussein ruled. I think the vast majority of them think of us as liberators. And I think your own polls show that, Terry. If you look at the poll that was done just recently by ABC, it shows a great deal of optimism and hope on the part of the Iraqi people that their lives are better and going to get better in the future. So I really believe that the notion that somehow the Iraqi people opposed what we did when we came in and toppled Saddam Hussein, or that a majority of them were against it, is just dead wrong. It's not true. I think a majority of them support it.
If I may, that poll shows that half of Iraqis say the invasion should not have happened. That's what our poll showed.
But it shows that the majority of them want us to stay and finish the job and get the job done. And I've had the experience just this week. We met with 11 Iraqi voters in the Oval Office after they'd voted. These were Iraqis who voted in the United States because they're out of the country temporarily. It was a remarkably moving moment, and anecdotal evidence of how deeply they feel about the U.S. presence and about what we did for them. Many of them saying, look, a lot of us can't say it publicly, fearful still of saying anything to identify themselves with Americans because they're still worried about the terrorists that are out there, or the remnants of the old regime that might come after them. There's still politicians running for office who've been assassinated. It's still a hostile environment, made hostile by a relatively small part of the population. But their overwhelming sentiment was one of expressing gratitude to the President of the United States for what he had done to liberate Iraq, and the fact that they're all now able to vote in a free election. One of them, as a matter of fact, a young woman from Fallujah, who had served as an interpreter for the Marine Corps in Fallujah, who's back in the U.S. now, is enlisting in the Marine Corps so she can come back and serve in the United States Marine Corps as a Marine in Iraq.
Let me take you back to something else you said before the war. Or actually, not before the war, just last May. You said that the insurgency was in its last throes. And while this plane goes over, since you said the insurgency was in its last throes, hundreds of American GIs have been killed. Thousands of Iraqis have been killed, and the lethality of the insurgency hasn't seemed to diminish at all. What did you mean by saying it was in its last?
In fact, the number of attacks has declined. You can look at the level of attacks, for example, during the election period in January, the election period in October, the election period in December, and you'll see that there has been a decline in the number of incidents, attack incidents. Excuse me. The basic point, one I've made already, is that I believe that the elections were the turning point, and we had that election in January, first free election in Iraq in decades, and that we will be able to look back from the perspective of time and see that 2005 was the turning point, was the watershed year, and that the establishment of a legitimate government in Iraq, which is what that whole political process is about, means the end of the insurgency. Ultimately, it may take time, may hang on for a while, but if you go back, there was a message we intercepted a couple of years ago from Zarqawi, where he was in effect communicating with bin Laden and his associates in Al-Qaeda, as I recall the story, but the specifics of it were that he was fearful that once a democracy was established in Iraq, he would have to look for another venue to operate in. He'd have to move on to some other locale. That's my point, that in fact the political process, as it proceeds successfully, and as I say, they've made every single milestone, represents ultimately the end of the insurgency, because there will be a legitimate democratic government in Iraq, and I don't think the insurgents will be able to stand up to it.
There's still a great debate in our country about how we got into this war, and many Americans, most according to some polls, believed that you and the president misled the country into this war by deliberately exaggerating the threat from Saddam Hussein and deliberately suppressing the doubt and uncertainty that we now know existed in the intelligence community about his weapons of mass destruction program. You said in 2002 there is no doubt, but there was. Did you know it?
No,
at the
but
time?
Terry, go back and look at the studies that have been. Look at the analysis that was done by the Rob Silberman Commission or by the Senate Intelligence Committee. Everybody believed in advance that he did in fact have weapons of mass destruction. Turned out the intelligence was wrong, but all of the studies show that at no time was there ever pressure brought to bear on the intelligence community, that we in fact reported what we received. The statements I made tracked almost perfectly with what was coming out of the intelligence community during that period of time. The director of the CIA, when asked by the President of the United States in the Oval Office, how good is the intelligence on WMD, said it's a slam dunk case. That was the view of the intelligence community. There might have been people someplace down in the bowels of the organization who didn't agree with it, but that was never communicated.
You
to us.
never heard any
Everybody-
doubt about these
No,
programs?
everybody, it was very solid, slam dunk case was the way it was presented. But beyond that, I mean, to some extent, that's a bit of a side issue, because what we did was exactly the right thing to do. As the President said the other day, if we had the decision to make over again, knowing what we know now, would we have done it? And the answer is absolutely. Just remember what the circumstances were. You had Saddam Hussein, who was a man who'd perpetrated 2 wars, started 2 wars, who produced and used weapons of mass destruction, a man who was in fact providing safe haven for terror, making $25,000 payments to the families of suicide bombers, provided sanctuary for Abu Nidal, for Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a man who did have a relationship with terrorist organizations and who had in fact produced WMD in the past and used it. This was an evil man, and in fact, in the aftermath of 9/11, after we lost 3,000 Americans that morning, and we were faced with the prospect that terrorists would try to acquire those deadlier capabilities to use against us, that we could no longer sit back and tolerate or accept a situation where the United States just played defense, where we didn't go on offense and attempt to deal both with the terrorists themselves as well as state sponsors of terror. Saddam qualified by every standard. We did exactly the right thing. The world is far safer with Saddam out of business, and Iraq will be a democracy, a government that has capable of defending its own interests, taking care of itself, will help fundamentally transform this part of the world because of what we've accomplished here, what the troops are doing here, and what the Iraqis themselves are doing.
Let me shift gears. The president has now acknowledged authorizing and reauthorizing more than 30 times a program to spy on Americans without any warrant from any court. This is a huge change.
I think that's a slight distortion of what the president said. The president said is that we will use all of our power and authority, the decision we made after 9/11, to do everything we can to defend the country. That's our obligation. We take an oath of office to do that.
That's not in dispute.
And that when we have a situation where we have communication between someone inside the United States and an acknowledged al-Qaeda or terror source outside the United States, that's something we need to know. And he has authorized us to look at that. And it is, in fact, consistent with the Constitution. It's been reviewed. It's reviewed every 45 days by the President himself, by the Attorney General of the United States, by the President's Counsel, by the Director of the CIA. It's been briefed to the Congress over a dozen times. And in fact, it is a program that is, by every effort we've been able to make in San Diego, prior to the attack, in contact with al-Qaeda sources outside the United States. We didn't know it. 9/11 Commission talks about it. If we'd had this capability, then we might well have been able to stop
But, Mr. Vice President, this is a program that surveils people inside the United States.
who
And
are
the
in touch
Constitution-
with al-Qaeda
Don't you
terrorists
have to have
outside
a
the United
court
States.
give permission for that? In any other circumstance, to eavesdrop on communications in America?
Terry, these are communications that involve acknowledged or known terrorists, dirty numbers, if you will. And in fact, it is consistent with the President's constitutional authority as Commander-in-Chief. It's consistent with the resolution that was passed by the Congress after 9/11. And it has been reviewed repeatedly by the Justice Department every single time it's been renewed to make certain that it is in fact managed in a manner that's fully consistent with the Constitution and with our statutes.
But that's all the executive branch. The Constitution calls for a court, the co-equal branch of government, as a check on the power of the executive, to give a say-so before an American or someone in America is surveilled or searched or spied upon.
This has been done, Terry, in a manner that is completely consistent with our obligations and requirements, I can assure you.
And
that's one of the reasons we hold it and watch it so carefully. That's why it has to go to the President every 30 to 45 days to make absolutely certain we are in compliance with all of those safeguards with respect to individual liberty, and that it is managed in a very conservative fashion. And it is signed up to by the Attorney General of the United States and reviewed by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department. So we spent a lot of time making certain that this is in fact safeguarded. And as I say, we briefed Congress on it, just a few members, the leadership, on over a dozen occasions.
let me take you up on that. Senator Graham of Florida, ex-Senator Graham, who was on the Intelligence Committee at the time this program began, suggested to us that when you briefed him, you misled him. You didn't tell him the full scope of the program. That's his feeling now that he sees it exposed.
Well, that's not true.
He knew.
He knew. I sat in my office with General Hayden, who was then the head of NSA, who's now the deputy director of the National Intelligence Directorate, and he was briefed as long as he was chairman of the committee, a ranking member of the committee.
The president has said we do not torture, and Senator McCain proposed a measure in part to vindicate those values that would ban the cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of any person in U.S. custody anywhere in the world. Why did you fight so hard against that?
Well, we ultimately reached a compromise between the president and Senator McCain, and it was arrived at just last week. But what I, excuse me, the position I took was one that was the position the administration had taken when we signaled to the Congress that we were prepared to veto a bill that went farther than we thought it should in terms of trying to restrict the prerogatives of the president. And,
how so
and the
when it
executive
comes
branch.
to cruel, inhuman? What's the president's prerogative
Well, it was
in
a
cruel
question.
treatment of prisoners?
There's a definition that's based on prior Supreme Court decisions and prior arguments, and it has to do with the 4th, 13th, and the 3 specific amendments to the Constitution. And the rule is whether or not it shocks the conscience. If it's something that shocks the conscience, the court has decreed that crosses over the line. Now, you can get into a debate about what shocks the conscience and what is cruel and inhuman, and to some extent, I suppose that's in the eye of the beholder. But I believe, and we think it's important to remember that we are in a war against a group of individuals, terrorist organization, that did in fact slaughter 3,000 innocent Americans on 9/11. That it's important for us to be able to have effective interrogation of these people when we capture them. And the debate is over the extent of which we're going to have legislation that restricts or limits that capability. Now, say we've reached a compromise, the president signed on with the McCain Amendment. We never had any problem with the McCain Amendment. We had problems with trying to extend it as far as he did, but ultimately, to say a compromise was arrived at, and I support the compromise.
Should American interrogators be staging mock executions, waterboarding prisoners? Is that
I'm
cruel?
not going to get into specifics. You're getting into questions about sources and methods, and I don't talk about that, Terry.
As Vice President of the United States, you can't tell the American people
I
whether
don't
or
talk
not we
about.
would interrogate
I can
them.
say that we, in fact, are consistent with the commitments of the United States, that we don't engage in torture, and we don't.
Are you troubled at all that more than 100 people in U.S. custody have died, 26 of them now being investigated as criminal homicides, people beaten to death, suffocated to death, died of hypothermia in U.S. custody?
No, I won't accept your numbers, Terry, but I guess one of the things I'm concerned about is that as we get farther and farther away from 9/11,